Hello and welcome to another video, and today we will not be playing a game. We will instead be creating one. And so I was lying in bed one night and I thought of a game idea. I would take a food truck and I would put it in a world filled with a fantasy style world. And the world would not have any good alignment people. It would all be monsters essentially. And so then I came up with the brilliant name Monster Truck. And so then I had to decide what to do, what style of game would it be. And so I decided on I wanted a sandbox style business game, like a restaurant tycoon, for example. Except you build up your food truck with equipment and stuff, and then you can create certain menu items and then sell those menu items to the monsters so that you do not die and you cannot be found out. You basically are isolated to your wagon, which is what your food truck essentially, for the rest of your life. And so now that I've come up with the game idea, I have to implement it. And so I had to decide on the style of art I wanted to use. Now, for my past games, I've used 2D pixel art, and I'm not good at pixel art. So I decided no pixel art. I wanted to open up my dusty Blender that I haven't touched in 3 years and try to do something with that. So the first thing I have to create in Blender is the wagon, obviously. And so I went into Blender armed with the knowledge that E stands for extrusion, and I quickly found myself overwhelmed. And so first thing I did was watch 3 or so tutorials to relearn Blender again. And now I use the mirror modifier and extrusion, and I ended up with a decent looking wagon. And so the next thing I had to do was texture the wagon. Now this I had never, ever done. So, yay. And so first thing I had to learn was UV wrapping, which was, not fun. But after watching yet again another tutorial, I figured out the basics of UV wrapping. And so with that done, then I could do textures. And so the first thing I tried to do was paint the logs. And I had basically two options. I had the very detailed wood texture that you could find off on Google Images, or I could hand paint. And since I want this to be a cartoony style game, because if it's not cartoony, it's going to look terrible, because the only thing I could possibly come up with is a cartoon style. So it's going to be cartoony. And so I tried hand painting. And after throwing random colors on top of each other, I thought, that's not going to work. And so what I did was I looked up a tutorial for wood, and I found this tutorial about musgrave. And the musgrave node looked great. And so I stuck with that. I threw a bunch of lines on an image with different colors, and then I put a musgrave node on it. And, that worked out great. And so then I had to do the planks. Now, the planks cannot be using a musgrave because, they're planks. They need lines in between them because that's what planks do. And so I used Polygon, Blender Guru's thingy that has a bunch of textures on it. And it had a plank texture, and it had a blurred plank texture, which was perfect for my cartoonish style. And so there are only two textures left. I needed fabric and metal, and once again I used Blender Guru's metal and fabric texture, and that worked out great as well. And so now all I had to do was do the scenery around the wagon. I needed grass and trees and probably a few other things that I'm going to ignore. So first thing I did was a tree. And so I looked up a tutorial for tree leaves, and then, they worked fantastic. With the tree done, now I had to do the grass, and so I followed yet another tutorial to figure out how to make little grass blades pop out, and then I followed a tutorial for the gradient texture on the grass, for it to be dark at the bottom and light at the top, since that's how light works. And so I did that, and then I took it all and I threw it in Unity, and then problems have arisen. First problem, my musgrave texture is no longer existent. It is now just the stupid line stuff that I drew, and that does not look good. Or doesn't look, oh well, it looks half decent. And the back face culling, which is a big word standing for everything looks screwed up, because when you go inside the wagon, which you're going to have to be inside the wagon for this game for it to work. So you go inside the wagon and the faces are now gone. They've disappeared. And on the outside, there's a window that you can look in. And so the faces are gone through the window and stuff like that. All sorts of faces gone. And what I figured out is now I have to go back in Blender and flip the normals on some of the faces. And I had to add faces and flip their normals for some of the things because they didn't have two sides to them. And then everything worked out, except for the fact that my gradient on the grass was still gone, and so was the musgrave texture. So, okay then. Anyway, I ignored that for the time being, and instead went on to duplicate the grass a bunch of times until it made a big plane, and so I could finally get started on the main menu scene. And so I have the wagon, and I have the grass, and I have the trees. And then I immediately noticed that there are not enough trees. And how am I going to get a background? Because it's just gray or blue or whatever background right now. And that's not good either. And so I got to get a tree background somehow. And so I had to look up another tutorial for lighting and, the forest background. But I put the forest background on hold. So lighting. And so I found that with the lighting, I could add fog and have lighting at the same time. And with the fog, it fogs out stuff far away. So if I just have enough objects, then it'll look like a forest background without me actually having to have a forest background. And maybe that's how a forest background is anyway. I don't know, because I've never made a 3D game like this before. So anyway, that was great. And so now I just needed more scenery items. So the first thing I decided to make was a bush. And basically I just used the same thing that I used for the leaves, except now there's no branches. And then I made a twig, which is essentially just a mini tree, and that was fine. I didn't do the musgrave texture on the wood, because that was pointless. And then I needed to make another tree. And so for this big tree, I wanted its trunk to look nice. And so with the tutorial as a reference, the tutorial that I used to make my leaves, I drew up, I sculpted a decent looking tree. And then I decided to hand paint the tree. And so this time I actually tried to do my best. And so I painted on the base color, then I added some green to the bottom, and then I darkened the crease areas, and then I highlighted the upper areas. And you know what? My basic painting, which I learned from, miniature painting, I used on it, and it worked. It actually worked. And it looks probably better than anything else I'm going to make. So that's great. And so then I have my second tree. And so I put all my stuff in. I put the trees, put the twigs, put the bushes, and all that. And then there was one more problem. I could see the sky. Now, Unity's thing generated clouds for me, which is nice and all, but it doesn't match with my cartoon texture. And I didn't want to see the sky. So what I would do, what I did, because, I want this to be a forest, and I don't want to see the clouds, because the forest is supposed to block out the clouds. So I could have two options. I could lower the FOV of the camera, the field of view, and I didn't really want to do that because it would get too small, but I could lower it a bit, which I did. But I could also create hills in the background. And so then I opened up Blender again, and I made big hills to cover the background. And then those blocked out most of the sky. And there was no sky left after lowering the FOV a bit. And so that worked out great. And so now that I made that, now I have my entire forest. And so now there's just one tiny problem. One, my gradients on my grass is still gone, and I kind of want that. And I figured that there'd be some way to do it. So I looked up a tutorial yet again on how to make a gradient in Unity. And I found one, and I had to use shader graphs, another thing that I had never done before. So I followed the tutorial, and then I made a gradient shader graph. And then the gradient now finally worked. It was amazing. And I looked at the scenery and I thought, it's kind of static. It doesn't move around. It needs wind. And so I looked up another tutorial on how to do wind. And there was this, once again, I used shader graphs and I followed the tutorial. And this was actually the easiest part of the whole thing, of all the things that I've done in this section of time, was the wind, because the tutorial worked perfectly. There were literally no problems. And so now I had wind, and now everything looked amazing. And now I could finally get on to something I knew how to do, which is coding, my best field. And so now I don't have to watch 60 billion, trillion, million tutorials to figure out how to do something. And so the first thing I had to do was I had to make a sign that I had to make a play button so I could open up the windows in my wagon and then zoom in, and then I could press buttons for, the new game options, all that stuff. And so the first thing I decided to do was, then I had a problem. I had to decide, what did I want to do for the UI? Did I want to do pixel art? Did I want to do the standard stuff? I did not know. And so I decided to try to do pixel art. And it looked absolutely awful. And so I decided, you know what, let's open up Blender once again. And so I made a sign in Blender, and I made an alphabet with a monsterish font to it using sculpting. And it looked great. And I had chains and stuff to hold down the sign from the wood beam. And so then I clicked, and so now all I had to do was do the coding part. So I would click the play sign, and then the camera zooms in, and then the window opens. Except I got one problem here. My windows are part of the object, and they do not open correctly when they rotate. And so I had to basically go to my food wagon Blender file, and then separate the windows from that, and then separate the windows because they were both one object, and then move their origins, and then I could finally rotate them in the proper way. And so now that's that done, I added a few bits of code, and I could click the play button, and now the camera zooms in and the windows open. And now it's looking great. And so now all I have to do is have the buttons on the windows. And so once again, I got to use my monster font, my monster alphabet. So I made the rest of the letters of the alphabet in the monster font, put it in, and now I have to generate the code that spawns in the monster alphabet for each button, because there's got to be different layers to each section of the menu. So like if you open up options, then you kind of want to see, your choices, and I don't have enough room for that because I only have 4 buttons. So I need to click on a button and then delete all the other stuff and replace it with new stuff. And so now I had to make the code for that. And the hard part was figuring out the spacing, because I had to modify the alphabet's scale and position so that they would properly take up the amount of space I want it to on each of the hinges of sorts. And so I had to figure out the proper formula for the spacing depending on how much alphabet there was. And so I found that 6 letters, when spaced out appropriately by hand manually, put side by side, took up the perfect amount of space. And each of those 6 letters was 0.1 in their length. And so I had 0.6 of the space that I had to divide into, that I basically had to fit my letters into. And so I had to make a formula to lower the scale of each alphabet until they would basically perfectly fit inside that 0.6. And so I first made a terrible formula that was only worked for 2 extremes. Basically, it would work for 6 letters and it would work for 60 letters, but it would not scale down appropriately because 12 letters would not take up half the space. And it needed to 12 letters there needed to be 2 letters for each 0.1. And there were not 2 letters for each 0.1. And so I needed to make a formula for that. And so after fooling around with different calculators, with algebra calculators and graphing calculators, I finally figured out this simple formula, which was this original scale where the length was 0.1, which is 0.3. 0.3 was the scale, and divided by the length, how many letters there were, divided by 6, because there were, you know, 0.6 spots that the 6 letters that the original thing could fit into. And with that done, all I had to do was add a few extra things like disappearing and reappearing, and then everything was essentially done. And now there's only one thing, and then I looked at it and I thought, you know, there's only one thing that was needed. The play sign was a little too static, and so I wanted essentially the play sign to shake when you clicked on it and have the chains, you know, like fall around the shaking. And so now I had to get chain physics. But the problem was I didn't know how to make chain physics. And so I looked up a billion tutorials and not a single one of them worked. I spent like 4 hours trying different tutorials and different methods to get the chains to work using, you know, configurable joins, all other sorts of stuff, and nothing worked the way I wanted it to. And so I gave up because that was yesterday. And now it's today. And today is the time that I have to make the YouTube video. So, you know, I'm just going to give up on the chains because I don't want to and I don't care. So now everything looks good except for the chains. So I'm just going to leave the chains the way they are and everything will be well. And so the only thing left, and so I click play, I look at it, and I think, you know, it looks great. Except the only thing missing is, you know, the chains and then sound and music. But I hate sound design and I hate making music. And so, you know, we're just going to drop that for the time being. And that's pretty much all the progress I've made. And so now we'll talk about what I'm going to do before the next video begins. And so I'm going to work onto the opening story and the opening cutscene. And then I'm going to work on a research system where very happy customers reveal like info and research that'll help you unlock new stuff, like, you know, new equipment, which will be, I feel like the equipment's going to be designed by like a gnome. Like a gnome creates cool inventions that, you know, mimic modern day equipment, and that'll be interesting. And then there'll be the first encounter, and I won't spoil any of that, but I've planned it out a bit. And then there'll be the initial equipment and that you can get. And then that's going to be probably it for that section, unless I can fit more into that, which probably not. It's probably going to take a while to do all that stuff. But that's it. Now, if you want to look at any of the tutorials that I used, I'm going to have them all linked in the description. Not all of them, because some of them I looked at and, you know, they didn't work, and so I'm not going to link the tutorials that, you know, didn't work. So I'm going to link most of the tutorials that, you know, definitely can be seen in the stuff that I created. And that's it for this video. Goodbye.